Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me well? Yeah, okay. So, my name is Omer Yoachimik. I'm the product manager for Cloudflare's DDoS Protection service. My team manages and provides the capabilities to detect and mitigate DDoS attacks for the Cloudflare network, but also for our customers. And I just arrived yesterday in Seattle. It's actually the first time I've been here in probably 28 years. So it's quite nice being back. Beautiful city, beautiful weather. Anyone here also like first time in Seattle, or? I see some hands. Okay, cool. So also, before we get started, I'm curious to know kind of who you are. So if you could just raise your hand if you're like maybe executives, C-levels. Not a lot of those. I see one, a few, okay. Managing directors, team leads, and stuff like that. Okay, and if you're more of a hands-on, architects, network operators, admins, okay, that seems to be the majority. Okay, I need to be careful with what I say then. Okay. So it's a privilege to be here speaking in Nanog, and I hope you will find this presentation interesting, helpful, useful. If you have any feedback or questions or anything, we'll have time for that afterwards, but you can also reach out to me in the conference itself, but also online as well. And if you see anything specifically that you like, that you find interesting, feel free to take photos of the deck. There's nothing classified here. Tweet about it, post it, also tag me as well. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to defend, prepare and defend your organizations against DDoS attacks. Specifically, the case study that we're going to be talking about is Ransom DDoS attacks that targeted a Fortune Global 500 company. Before we do that, we'll just set the stage with the current DDoS threat landscape. So we'll review that, make sure we understand what's going on today. Take a look at some interesting trends that are probably worth your attention, and then kind of review that real world case study. So, probably don't need this because most of you can probably teach this to me better. DDoS attack, type of cyber attack that wants to take your internet property offline, right? A simple example is an HTTP flood. Who can give me another example of a DDoS attack? Something that you maybe encountered? Anything? What? SYN flood, yes, we love SYN floods. It's actually been the most popular attack vector for a few quarters now, a few years now. But we've seen that go down into second place, and now I think DNS attacks actually took the first place. If not the last quarter, then it'll be this quarter. So it seems that it's been very, very busy. Like DDoS is not a new type of cyber attack, and it's just attackers are not, they don't stop. It keeps on and on. We see these examples of botnets attacking as part of the Ukraine-Russia war, attacking Trudeau's websites, taking down US airport websites, and so on and so forth. And it's just too much even to keep track of. It's been so exhausting, all of these kind of constant campaigns that have been going on. And so with that in mind, kind of let's take a look at what we observed on our network kind of in the past few months. So the main themes or insights of the attacks in general is that most of the attacks are small. They're short. They end within less than 10 minutes. They rarely exceed half a gigabit per second. It's what we call cyber vandalism. It's your basic script kiddies playing around with hping 3 or curl commands in loops or whatnot. But we've also seen larger attacks and much more sophisticated attacks becoming more frequent. Something that I'll talk about in a few slides is that attacks that we, in the past, associated to state-level actors and capabilities are now becoming more and more common, which is something to keep an eye on. So when we look at the top industries that were attacked in the previous quarter, it was quite surprising to see that 12% of all traffic that we saw to, this is layer 7 traffic, served to nonprofit organizations were DDoS attacks. We were not expecting that this quarter. It's usually gaming and stuff like that, where the money is and where latency matters. In terms of layer 3-4, we saw that the media was under a lot of attacks as well. Almost half of the traffic to broadcast media websites was DDoS attacks in layer 3-4. Then when we kind of break it down regionally, previously we saw that in the US, telcos were the most targeted, but that can also be a little deceiving because telcos serve as a kind of an aggregator for all of their end customers, right? But nevertheless, we saw it targeting their ASNs. But now we saw that marketing and advertising companies were the most targeted in Northern America. The banking, financial services, and insurance industry was the most targeted in South America. And then telco in Africa, gaming in Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, and in Europe, and health and wellness in Oceania. It's very interesting to see the seasonality of it, because in Q4, for example, a lot of people go on holidays and travel. We saw that like in South America, and I think it was also in Africa, it was actually hospitality that was the most targeted industry. And in the Middle East, it was actually educational websites and platforms. So as an example of one of these attacks that we saw, this is a South American telco. This is an attack that we saw launched by a very scary version of Mirai, right? The Mirai code is out there. People are tweaking it, playing with it. And what was interesting about this one, I'm thinking about the next one. That one was a little scarier. But this one was a regular Mirai botnet attack, which was mitigated, was 1.3 terabit per second, only lasted a minute. That's kind of what I want you to take away from this, right? So even the largest attack that we see ends super fast. What this means is that you can't rely on humans to take action because before the pager duty alert even goes out, the attack is over. And if there was impact, it was already done. And this is the second attack that I mentioned, a different telco provider. Each blast there, each spike was less than a minute, reaching a terabit per second or almost a terabit per second. And what was scary about this one is that it was so randomized, combining a lot of attack vectors, very random attack vectors from port map to VXWork traffic. This is, I think, probably the most sophisticated version of Mirai that we saw. Now, kind of taking a step a little broader, the countries that were targeted the most in terms of layer 3-4 traffic. And by the way, we measure this by taking the percentage of attack traffic and dividing it by the total amount of traffic to that country or to that industry. That's kind of to normalize, because otherwise the US would probably always be first in everything because of the amount of traffic. But in Finland, we did see that it jumped to the first place, perhaps because of the discussions and decisions made around its NATO membership, perhaps not. So just let that figure sink in. 83% of traffic to Finland, or internet properties that are on Cloudflare, that have a billing address of Finland, to be the most accurate, were DDoS attacks. In layer 7, it's Slovenia and Georgia in the first and second places. And when we look at it differently, so in terms of absolute traffic, something very different happened. So like I said, US has usually the most attack traffic in terms of total volume or the total throughput. But Israel jumped to the first place in the past quarter. So almost 1% of all of the attack traffic that Cloudflare saw, DDoS attack traffic, that we saw in Q1, was targeted against Israeli internet properties. That's an insane figure. It could be because of the tensions in the West Bank. It could be due to the political lack of stability. It could have been because of the protests due to the judicial reforms that are kind of taking place. We don't know. We can only speculate. But nevertheless, it's still a very interesting figure, I think, to see that attacks targeting that tiny country even was larger than all of the attacks that targeted the US, for example. Now, where are these attacks coming from globally? So in terms of layer 3-4 traffic, we don't use the source IP because obviously it can be spoofed. So instead, we look at where we saw the packet being ingested, in which Cloudflare data centers. We have 290 plus locations around the world, so we were kind of able to get a geographical accuracy to some extent, taking into consideration kind of all of the different shifts in traffic. And anyway, Vietnam, Paraguay, Moldova were the first places. So between a quarter and a fifth of all traffic ingested in those data centers to Cloudflare was actually layer 3-4 attacks. And again, Finland was also a source of layer 7 attacks, followed by the Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and Libya. Now, what are the main attack vectors? So we heard about SYN floods. So SYN floods went down to number 2. SYN floods are usually very popular because they usually require a stateful mitigation system to be able to cope with it properly. It's the initial connection request. You might not have a lot of context about that request, about that connection. So that's why I think that attackers really like SYN floods. But we've seen DNS floods significantly increase on the right. Yes, it's on the right side as well. They increased by almost 1,000%. And I'll talk about this in a slide or two, so I'll move on to the next ones. So UDP, reflection attacks and floods, always very popular. UDP attacks are very hard to fingerprint, very hard to mitigate, because you just don't have enough packet headers or attributes to actually be able to differentiate well between legitimate and non-legitimate, traffic, unless you use some kind of more sophisticated methods. And in the emerging threat side of things, we constantly see different types of UDP attacks or UDP-based reflection attacks that kind of change and vary every quarter. These change very frequently. We see attackers trying new or old methods again, kind of even the chargen protocol, something very old. That's something that we saw spike a few quarters ago. So they're just constantly trying to find the kind of the attack vector that will work, even if it's an older one. So I'm hoping that helped kind of understand the threat landscape a little bit. Now I want to focus on 3 trends that I think are kind of worth highlighting. So the first one is the highly randomized HTTP DDoS attacks. In the past, these level of capabilities were associated with state-level actors to achieve that level of randomness and distribution. We're seeing them randomize everything from JA3 headers to imitating the order of the headers properly, like client browsers would do, just making it so very hard to differentiate between legitimate and attack traffic. Just recently, this is in the past weeks, we saw a major VoIP provider being the target of one of those, very dominant semiconductor provider, and a tier payment and credit card provider as well. So that's one trend, and I have an examples of each one of those. The second thing is about DNS, what I mentioned a few times so far. I like calling this DNS laundering attacks because it's a random prefix attack, and I'll explain what that is if you don't know. But the attackers are laundering it through legitimate resolvers. So let's say that you, for example, have your own DNS infrastructure, and you have your website. You manage a few websites or domains that you serve from those servers. So the attackers will query legitimate providers like Google's 8888 and so on. They will query for random prefixes on domains that you actually serve. So nothing will ever be served from cache because they rarely query for one random prefix more than once. And these are of domains that you actually manage. So it may, like, there isn't a specific domain, like you can't block access to that domain because then you'll cause yourself an outage to that domain. And you can't block the sources because the sources are legitimate, right? It's Google, it's Cloudflare, it's all of the major DNS resolvers. So it's a very tricky situation. A few examples are a large North American DNS provider and a large Asian, very substantial Asian financial institution. The third kind of threat or trend that's worth your attention, I think, is the fact that we're seeing more and more botnets kind of migrate from IoT to VPS-based, so virtual private servers or VMs, whatever you want to call it. In the past, right, Mirai and other types of botnets relied on sometimes millions of bots of little IoT devices that have very low capacity or throughput capability and CPU capabilities, and they needed massive fleets of them to generate substantial attacks. This required a lot more work, right? Because you have to write the malware, you have to propagate it, you have to kind of identify these IoT devices to grow your botnet and hope it doesn't get taken down. And then even with millions of bots, we saw that these botnets like rarely peaked above 1, 2, 3, like just a few million requests per second, which is a lot for a website that's not protected, but it's very small compared to like the recent attack that we've seen. Now, the newer modern version of the botnets are actually tapping into the cloud computing business. So the cloud computing, AWS was here a minute ago. They provide a platform to help businesses deliver performant applications at scale, right? And then these cloud computing providers, I'm not saying AWS, but these cloud computing providers also are enabling high performance botnets. So we're seeing botnets with a fraction of the amount of nodes, of VMs or VPSs, in the thousands, in a few thousand, and each one of those is roughly 5,000 times stronger than an IoT device. And with those types of botnets, we've seen very large attacks that are even kind of showing off and doing making sure that they're like over HTTPS, which is like an extra overhead from the computational perspective, just to show that they can, not that it matters for us. And this targeted some of the a very leading, like a major gaming platform provider. Now, to give some examples, so this is an example of a very recent fully randomized HTTP GET flood. It had only 15,000 devices. It wasn't that big. So this one only peaked at 13,000 RPS. But so this is the thing. When attacks are really large, it's like easy to mitigate, right? It stands out. Anyone can look at a time series and say, yep, that's the one. When it's smaller, when it tries to hide within your legitimate traffic, it's very hard to spot. And in this time series, what we excluded is the legitimate traffic. So this is just the attack traffic. And if I haven't had done that exclusion, you wouldn't even been able to tell through their kind of normal traffic patterns. It didn't even stand out. But they knew which endpoints are expensive based on latency, so they kind of targeted them in a very randomized way. So these are they can be very painful attacks. And then the DNS laundering attack that we talked about, reflection of a random prefix attack. We actually don't know what the size and type of botnet this is because we're only seeing the reflection. This specific one came from over 300 IPs from 100 different DNS providers. And the last one, which is my favorite, because it was the largest in recorded history, this was a 71 million requests per second HTTP2 encrypted flood. That first spike you see there, that was only 30 seconds. So there's, like, and the entire thing was 5 minutes. And we were monitoring this group for a while on their Telegram channels, because obviously the Telegram channels are open. And they're kind of bragging and like, yeah, let's target this one next. Why don't you target that one? Just showing off. And they have all of these DStat websites where they kind of show off and have their leaderboards of their botnets. This one came, like most of the traffic here, or a substantial portion of it, came from a US provider, a US hosting provider. It was when we saw that they're like, yeah, I think I can take this now to 100 million requests per second, is when we ringed up that hosting provider and kind of started the takedown attempts. I'm not going to disclose the information, but if you're that hosting provider, if you're here and you're aware of it, so thank you for your collaboration. We have been working with a lot of the hosting providers and service providers in general to crack down on botnets. And we've also provided a free threat feed because we see the entire attack, okay? So all of the traffic as part of the attack, but sometimes what we've heard from service providers, like reaching out to me on Twitter and LinkedIn, like, hey, we don't know what these IPs are. Can you help us? For us, it's just a fraction, just a few IPs maybe, and it might even be encrypted, so we can't see it. And so with this threat feed, that again, it's free, you can get intel on malicious traffic originating from your ASN. And through that partnership, we're able to kind of take down botnet attacks. And here's an example of like the before and after. So that botnet that launched the 71 million requests per second, here are some examples of its 40 and 60 million smaller attacks. Then in the middle there, that's when the script kiddies, it was literally script kiddies playing around with expensive toys, went to bed. And when they woke up, they found out that about 50% of their botnet was taken down. Since more efforts, that botnet has been probably fully decommissioned. We haven't seen it operating again. So I think kind of what I'd like for you to take away from this is partnerships and collaborations can help stop the attacks at their sources. Because it's a pain for the hosting providers, right? It can hurt their reputation, threat reputation, and also like social reputation. It costs money, and it's very hard to crack down on that fraud that's being done, either if it's kind of legit accounts that are being acquired, purchased and subscribed with stolen credit cards, or just hacked accounts, for example. So now I'd like to talk about kind of the main event, okay? We've set the stage, we kind of understand what's going on in the DDoS world, around the world, and now let's talk about this Fortune Global 500 company. So they were attacked by a ransom DDoS attack threat actor, and we helped them out, and afterwards, as I do in many cases, I interviewed their relevant team members that was the head of incident response and forensics. I wanted to understand the kind of the entire process from their perspective, what they experienced, what they learned, and if there's anything that kind of we can do to improve, and also if there are any kind of valuable lessons that we can share. So kind of just before diving in, let's do a quick recap of what is a ransom DDoS attack versus a ransomware attack, because ransomware attacks are, they require potentially or theoretically a lot more expertise and kind of, you have to have your foot in the door, right? You need an employee to click a link, you need someone to download something, open a file, open an email, and then the malware propagates within that network, within that corporate network. Whether it's encrypting files, deleting files, stealing files, and so that's a ransomware attack compared to a ransom DDoS attacks where you just need to know the IP or the domain, hire a booter service or fire up some VMs, and you got yourself a ransom DDoS attack. And so how does it usually play out? Actually before that, just also worth mentioning that we've seen the ransom DDoS attacks kind of increase throughout 2022 and kind of persist throughout the year. So this is the percentage of surveyed Cloudflare customers that reported being targeted by a ransom DDoS attacks or threatened. And that 16% in Q1 actually kind of hides what happened in January and March, where those figures were around 21 and 20%. So in January and March of this year, roughly 1 out of 5 respondents said that they were subject to a ransom DDoS attacks. So we do see it as something quite common. And how does it usually play out? So it starts with a demo attack. They will launch a small attack against one of your IPs, data centers, websites. Then they will email you and say, hey, we're gonna DDoS you until you pay us. This is your deadline. And if they mean business, if it wasn't an empty threat, then they'll DDoS you until you pay them, and it incrementally increases. And so we're going to look at this case study and start with their pre-attack posture, and then kind of see what the demo attack was, that small demo attack, the ransom note that they got, and their preparations kind of after receiving the ransom note and understanding in which situation they're currently in. So their pre-attack posture state was not really good. They weren't really prepared to deal with DDoS attacks. They relied on their service provider for out-of-path kind of routing, so an out-of-path scrubbing center, right? This is where the ISP has a dedicated machines that will mitigate attack traffic, and traffic is routed to it on demand when needed. So they didn't have any inline visibility detection or alerting or anything like that, just the regular alerts on CPU usage and bandwidth utilization to understand if a colo is healthy or not. And they kind of didn't even know what to do. They didn't have runbooks because they were never really DDoSed. They were never really a target. And so they just didn't really prepare very much, unfortunately. And so the attacker launched a demo attack. It was a small 80 gigabits per second attack. And I say small because it's small, in like large telco sizes, but for a regular enterprise that has very limited capacity, maybe 1 or 10 gigabit links, 80 gigabits sustained for an hour is a lot. And that demo attack caused an outage for them. So they kind of learned about the attack through notifications as things were spiking up, and then eventually the outage event. And then it took some time, but the ransom email that they got, they finally received it from one of their employees, because what ended up happening is that the attackers send the ransom notes to just publicly scrapable email addresses. So press @ support @ careers @ help @ and a lot of times the users, the admins of those inboxes aren't really security oriented, trained, or they just dismiss it as a spam or maybe kind of like a white hat hacker kind of trying to upsell them or something like that. So in many cases what we see is that they were just dismissed. And so once they realized that they were under a ransom attack, ransom DDoS attacks, because one of their employees actually kind of saw this and said, I don't know, I'll forward this to my security response team, and they did that, and then they put one and two together. This, by the way, is an example from a different customer, just to kind of provide to the anonymity, of course. They're a trading company, and we can't share their name. And so then once they figured out that they were under the ransom attack, they called their ISP. They had trouble getting a hold of them because it was after working hours. This was in Europe. And they activated the on-demand, meaning they the ISP did the rerouting of traffic inside the ISP networks to the scrubbing center. But that just ended up causing a lot more damage because it wasn't really tested properly. So IPsec tunnels broke and stuff like that. And although the demo attack was just 60 minutes, the network failures that they experienced from that rerouting were much more painful for the networking and application services team. So, and the demo attack was over, so it was like all for nothing. So it ended up causing them more pain and technical issues. And so they got in touch with us. We advised them not to pay the ransom, obviously. We onboarded them to our BGP-based routing solution called Magic Transit. And now they had like inline detection, visibility, alerting, customizations, and all of that. And then we waited for the attack. The deadline expired, but the attack never came. So we don't know if this was just kind of someone, with making empty threats, hoping to get the ransom fee, or something that we've seen also in the past, which is kind of like if you're a robber, kind of imagine the robbers from Home Alone in the car, trying to find a potential house to break into. When you see a house with lights on and maybe security cameras and maybe a dog barking, maybe you think to yourself, I'm gonna try the next one. I wanna reduce my risks and kind of save my resources. So it could have been deterrence that they detected a protection service in front of them, or it could have been an empty threat. We don't know, but in any way, they gained that real-time protection and visibility and all of that. And so what can we learn from this? So the first one is just use an always-on solution. The reason is that on-demand is a historical mistake, in my opinion. The on-demand concept of routing traffic to a scrubbing center. This is because back in the day, before the era of the cloud, DDoS vendors were providing appliances, right? That was their main business. And then their customers started telling them, hey, attackers are getting larger, and also we don't want to manage this appliance anymore, or can you kind of manage it remotely for us? And so that's how the cloud was, or the DDoS cloud service was kicked off. But those vendors didn't have sufficient know-how, infra, or capabilities to kind of build a cloud that will sustain all of their customers' always-on traffic. That's a lot of traffic. And we're talking about an early stage. And also, migrating from appliance business to a subscription-based business, cloud business, that would cannibalize their revenue stream of selling appliances, selling the licenses to the appliances, professional services, on-site services. So that hybrid approach was developed. So we'll build the cloud, but only route to us when you're under attack because we don't have enough capacity for like always on everything at the same time. And we still offer that at Cloudflare if you want it, but the best practice that we can recommend is to use an always-on, on-demand solution because I showed you the graphs of those larger attacks, right? Even the 71 million requests per second, it was 30 seconds, I think it was. So a human can't make a decision that quickly. And even if it's automated, still BGP propagation and all of that, assuming that it's BGP-based routing and not DNS, which will take even more time, the attack is over before an action is taken. So that's why you need it inline. And that's how you can also deal with I'd say the constant cyber vandalism that we see on the internet. The second thing is to understand your threat landscape, increase your visibility. So the ideal approach should be to understand your traffic patterns, and that's not always possible, especially if you're a service provider or telco. But as much as possible, enforce a positive and negative security model. So what you never want to receive, what you always want to make sure is never blocked. And make sure that you have the proper alerting and visibility and know what to do when things happen. And I guess this kind of ties into the third lesson, which is prepare and raise organizational awareness, even for the non-techie employees. So in this specific case with the Fortune 500 company, if they had received the email sooner, that would have given them more time, or they would have responded quicker, right? So the faster that it is reported internally, the faster the security incident response team can respond. I think it's a general kind of cybersecurity hygiene policy. Report everything. It's better to report a non-incident than not to report an incident. So encourage employees to report things. Don't penalize them for reporting something that isn't an incident, and also train them. So as an example with that email. And so, starting to wrap up, I just want to have a few more takeaways that summarize what we just talked about here. And then if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. So summary of the attack landscape. Attack durations and sizes are increasing, and their attacks hit fast and quick. And while they are initiated by humans, they are executed by bots. So to win, you have to kind of fight bots with bots. The second thing that we do see very sophisticated and persistent attackers. So even if it's not 71 million requests per second or 3 terabits per second, they will take the time to study your network, to scan your network, your applications, and try to identify and measure the expensive endpoints if it's an application. And just as an example, just popped in my head, we had a VoIP provider that mainly sees UDP traffic. And they were under a TCP attack, which was kind of weird to them because the TCP attack also caused them some damage. What I'm getting to is that the attacker identified a stateful firewall in line, and they kind of took advantage of the stateful firewall being there because they saw SYN challenges and stuff like that, and then they bombarded it until it failed open. So that's an example of how attackers will try to understand your network. So put your attacker cap on and think, like, how would you attack your network? And then deal with those. And so that was the main takeaways of kind of the landscape. And the main takeaway from the ransom attack is to use an always-on service, an automated one, obviously. Map your threat models and increase visibility, and prepare, educate your teams. And just kind of a summary slide, if you want to take a snapshot or something, with kind of a few best practices and examples of those. And with that, I would like to thank you. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and I hope you found this useful. So thank you.